On this Wednesday edition of 2020, and being a Wednesday, the morning after a federal budget, our special focus today on last night's federal budget handed down by the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. After two budget surpluses, we're faced with what is likely to be a decade of deficits. We're closing in on a federal election. There's a cost of living crisis and rising global uncertainty. But the Treasurer expressed optimism about Australia's economy. You might expect that from the Treasurer, but we'll talk about these sorts of things. But he's predicting that inflation will be within the Reserve Bank's target band by mid-year, with low unemployment and rising wages. The opposition has questioned the optimistic economic projections, suggesting that the budget relies on overly positive assumptions about inflation, unemployment and wage growth. So, was it a good budget or was it a bad budget? For a unique take that you won't hear anywhere else, we've been absolutely privileged once again to assemble a panel of finance experts to unpack the issues in the budget through a unique biblical Christian lens. Three guests joining us through this next hour. Emeritus Professor Rod St Hill, who is an economist. His background is in banking and higher education. Alex Cook, the founder of Wealth with Purpose, former stockbroker and a successful financial planner. And Gavin Martin, the founder of Cornerstone Wealth. He's based in Melbourne, where he's senior financial advisor. He services clients in line with timeless financial principles. Let me make a special welcome to 2020. First of all, to you in Melbourne, Gavin Martin, welcome.
G'day, Neil. Great to be with you, and Rod and Alex.
Welcome to you, Alex Cook.
Thanks, Neil. Always good to be back with these smart gentlemen.
And also to Dr. Rod St Hill. Welcome along to you, Rod.
Well, good morning, Neil and everybody. And as always, it's great to be with this marvellous panel.
You know, I like to start off not necessarily crunching numbers and being very pointed at particular elements of last night's budget, but I want to start off with some overall impressions. What if we start with Alex Cook here? Alex, overall impressions from last night's budget. You saw the Treasurer, he made the delivery, there's a context to all that, but what were your thoughts?
Look, I think overall it was, I'd call it dull, is what I'd call it. Most of the changes were very minor. When you look at, say, the tax cuts, all of the things were, minor tweaking. The main issue, though, is what you call it. You call it an election budget, right? There's a lot in there aimed at short-term relief. So the term you're going to hear bandied about for the next, week will be cost of living relief and cost of living budget, which I think is what they've tried to take aim at. Does it achieve that? Yeah, maybe in the short term, but as I say, most of the things were pretty minor. My concern, and this is probably the things I've been saying for years, is more the long-term impacts of what the budget is going to do. I mean, this is the largest budget deficit since the pandemic, and obviously the pandemic budget was mind-boggling. But, it's a $42 billion deficit over the next 12 months, and I think $180 billion over the next 5 years, and deficits as far as the eye can see. And that's, of course, and I think the shadow treasurer is correct, it is based on fairly rosy assumptions. There's a lot of uncertainty globally at the moment with all the tariffs and things coming out of the US. And so I think it is based on probably better than average assumptions. So that is a concern. But to me, I guess the biblical aspect of it is and I've said these same things before, I think we're stealing from future generations of Australians by just continuing to grow the debt pile. And what a lot of Aussies aren't probably aware of is this year is the year when Australia crosses over the $1 trillion in gross government debt. That's, I think, 12 zeros. Gavin's better at maths than me. He can probably clarify that for me.
These are scary things, aren't they? Scary figures.
Yeah.
And,
but they're not sustainable. Yeah.
Gavin Martin, we usually get you to zero in on what happens to the individual, what happens to someone who's an organisational leader, a business that might be just trying to survive or trying to flourish in our economy. What were your overall impressions?
Yeah, my overall impressions were that it was a very light-on, last-minute budget that Jim Chambers really didn't think he was going to deliver, and had to in the end after the cyclone up in Queensland. But yeah, it was almost bordering on being lazy. If you think about last year's main document, paper number 2, that has most of the meat in it, so the substance in it, 93 pages this year, 200 pages last year. So it really was a very light on budget, bordering on being lazy, and reflected in the way perhaps the tax cut. So the $500 of annual tax cut just applied across the board, whereas Labor would normally focus on those in the low and middle income. They could have implemented it that way, but coming up to an election, they're wanting to just affect everybody, get everyone a quick tax cut, whereas they could have actually been really targeted if they were sticking to their traditional roots. They would have actually applied it to those low and middle income earners and reinstated that tax rebate that has been in there in the past.
I pick up from you, there's an individual focus, so that microeconomic way of thinking about these things, maybe where we'll move in some of our conversation here. Rod St Hill, you like to look at big picture stuff. Sometimes, the macroeconomic perspective. What was your overall impression?
Well, yes, I do like to look at the macro perspective because I think it's really fundamental to human flourishing. Australia's big economic problem at the moment is low productivity. And I would have to say that this budget does nothing at all to address that issue. And in fact, most of the growth in the economy has actually come from government spending. And most government spending is financed by tax. So all that's really happening is that we're shifting the deck chairs, so to speak, and our biggest economic problem, which is very, very slow productivity growth. In fact, on some figures, we're going backwards, and that is going to constrain human flourishing at all different levels in our society. So I'm very disappointed by this budget, and even the tax cuts that were briefly touched on a little earlier, they don't come into effect until next year, so they're not going to provide immediate relief in any case.
When we talk about productivity, we're talking about, what sort of output there is. You want that to rise with
That's right.
less or same input. That's the way that sort of we talk about productivity. You can talk about that individually and then corporately.
A good measure of productivity is our GDP per hour worked, which is actually going backwards. So GDP, if you like, is the total size of the economic pizza, and we all get a little slice out of that. But if it's actually going backwards, then we can't all become better off. And that's the key to human flourishing, of course, is that as productivity increases, we're able to do more of those things that cause us to flourish as human beings.
Okay, let's get into the deep end early in our conversation here because, and this an interesting question, I'll get everyone's brief response here. Is there any ideological difference between Anthony Albanese and Treasurer Jim Chalmers and the opposition, Peter Dutton? Would that make any difference who was leading and governing the country, so around these issues of productivity?
You won't like what I'm going to say here, I don't think, Neil, but there's a difference in the basic philosophies of the people you mentioned, but I'm not sure that there's the courage to outwork that. We need massive structural changes to the federal government's approach to taxation and government spending. We need massive changes. What's happening with this budget and what has been happening over probably the last 5 or 6 budgets is that we're baking into the budget more and more expenditures that are what we economists call demand-driven, which means the government does not have control over that spending. And that is going to make it harder and harder and harder into the future to deal with things like the size of the national debt. And that ultimately will reduce the capacity that our children have to flourish as human beings.
Okay, government loses control over how it spends. We're talking about both sides here, but there is this ideological difference here. Alex Cook, do you have a contribution here? The ideological differences, would it be any different if the opposition was delivering that budget?
I think Rod hit the nail on the head. I think the differences in the rhetoric. So, for example, the Liberal Party would say they're more free market orientated. They're more about small business flourishing, etc. But I think in reality, as Rod said perfectly, there's just not the courage to make genuine long-term reforms. And I think you see that with both policies, for example. Both parties are virtually the same on immigration. They kind of wink at each other saying, yeah, we should lower immigration. But reality is neither of them want to do it because it's a very lazy, easy policy to keep the GDP artificially propped up. I often joke with people that Australia is a population Ponzi scheme. We keep bringing people in and the GDP goes up. But similar to Rod's point about the GDP, he was talking about GDP per capita based on hours work. But if you look at GDP per capita in general, it's been declining for the last 8 quarters. So in other words, the standard of living in Australia has been dropping significantly. And in fact, it's probably the biggest drop in 50 years. Over the last 3. So the standard of living is dropping very quickly, and I'm not sure that the Liberal Party is going to do anything that different to change that long-term direction. It needs a circuit breaker, and it needs someone with considerable courage. I'd hesitate to say we need a Donald Trump type personality to come in and change things and shake things up, but maybe we do. Maybe we need someone to come in and say big changes are needed in order to bring everything back under control and make it sustainable over the long term. And to Rod's point, we want a society where everyone can flourish. And that's not the direction we're going in and haven't been for a long time.
Gavin Martin, have you got a contribution on this level as, you're dealing with clients in your practice? Is there a particular dimension you can bring here about where people are going, cost of living issues, and maybe you're dealing with the well-heeled? I don't know. I'm just your perspective here, Gavin.
Yeah, my sense of it just around whether the coalition, I guess, ideologically focuses more on supporting business, and the idea of supporting business is getting that productivity increase that Rod was mentioning. Just in the reply, Angus Taylor last night suggested that rather than focusing on a measly tax break of $500 per annum in a year's time, that it would be better spent supporting businesses to grow and develop, increase productivity, and then that has the flow-on effect of helping us all by improving productivity, increasing the pie, so to speak.
Perhaps we've got some generalisations here happening because we're not talking about specific things that the Treasurer announced in the budget last night, but bringing the Christian dimension here, a biblical foundation. Come back to you for a moment here, Dr. Rod St. Hill. Followers of Jesus have always prioritised success and prosperity for families and communities. I don't think any of us are going to argue about that. Not necessarily the multinational conglomerates who we might all be able to say the rich are getting richer. What about those who are poor and middle level? What are your thoughts here about priorities when you're a follower of Christ?
Well, from the perspective of business, I believe that business was God's idea. And business is a gift to humanity for the purpose of creating wealth. Without wealth, you cannot flourish as human beings. So I do believe that a Christian approach to any kind of government policy must analyse it on the basis of what will this contribute to the development and the success of private businesses. Because that is where wealth is created. And if you go all the way back to Genesis 1:26-28, I believe that the mandate that God gives us there is actually wrapped up in business activities. And of course, we know that business has to be conducted in ways that are consistent with the Bible's focus on flourishing, on developing wealth, and on looking after those who, for reasons out of their control, are not able to fully participate in the economy. So those are the sorts of parameters that really matter, I think, in terms of business. But we really do need to be looking at how we make it more feasible for the entrepreneurs to take those risks that are necessary to get new businesses off the ground. And a successful business, of course, is one that solves a problem for somebody. And we need to make sure that we're generating graduates from our universities and high schools and vet colleges and so on who feel that they're living in an environment where they can take a risk. And I suspect that as the size of government grows, that though the risk-taking behaviour of people changes. And I think we see that wherever the size of government grows beyond about 25 to 30% of the economy, the incentive that people have to take risks drops away altogether. And the private sector begins to shrivel up. We really have to be champions of private businesses, and especially, as you suggest, family businesses, small businesses, which predominate in terms of the numbers of businesses in most countries.
Let's talk cost of living, because this seems to be the most important issue for all Australians heading into the upcoming federal election. We should anticipate that both sides, the government and the opposition, will have a real focus on this area. Let me come to you first, Gavin Martin. On cost of living issues, where do you think things landed with last night's federal budget?
I guess they're trying to do what they can to have the perception that they're addressing cost of living, but with very small and initiatives like the tax cuts. With the tax, I keep on talking about tax cuts. Sorry, I'm a bit concerned about it, but it only represents 20% of the growth in tax due to bracket creep, so our income's going up. So they're not actually returning back to us what they really should be. And I think there's a real case for, like Canada and Germany do, automatically index up tax rates in line with inflation, and it would probably address a lot of those cost of living issues in a very practical way. The other strategies of just giving handouts to address energy expenses or electricity costs, it's a very backdoor way of getting inflation down, because I think it does actually reduce the inflation rate in a backdoor kind of approach to it. So, I think there are better ways to do it than what they're doing it, and they're very band-aid.
Alex Cook, cost of living, what were your impressions?
Well, look, it's the classic short-term solutions, band-aid solutions, no long-term ones. If we take energy, for example, so, they've extended the electricity rebate, so it's $150 over the next 6 months. But what they probably failed to mention is that 2 weeks ago, the Australian Energy Regulator announced that electricity bills are going to go up 9% from July onwards. So Australians are going to cop a massive hit in energy, which is obviously a huge thing. Now, that ties in, though, to prosperity, because low-cost energy is very important to having a prosperous society, and particularly having a prosperous manufacturing sector. So one of the reasons why so much of Australia's manufacturing has disappeared is because of high energy costs. So I think a couple of weeks ago, Australia's last glass manufacturer shut down, and so Australia now has to import all its glass windows from China. Now, that seems to me to be madness if we just don't have a society that has the capacity to make things. And part of that is around energy. So to me, putting a short-term rebate does really nothing. I mean, at the end of the day, we need reform that leads to lower energy costs, especially, obviously, not just for households, but for businesses, so that we can have, a thriving manufacturing sector here, rather than literally it disappearing before our very eyes. So the whole point, I think, that's coming out of our discussion is we need genuine reforms across many different sectors that are going to permanently make shifts and long-term changes, as opposed to these constant band-aids. And the other sector, of course, is housing. Now, housing is absurdly expensive, whether, rents are up over 50% since the pandemic, house prices are at nosebleed levels. So if you can afford to buy into the housing market, you're probably a slave to your mortgage, which the bank, the Bible was very clear, don't be a servant to the lender. And then if you're trying to save and get into the housing market, and you're paying rent, rents have gone up enormously. So, and all the policies that they come up with, once again, like the Liberal Party wants to be able to have people to access their superannuation, for example, that's just going to drive the price up even more and take away from people's long-term retirement savings. So to me, we need things that are going to actually get the cost of housing down. One of those would be enormous cuts to immigration, in my view. Immigration has a genuine sort of net positive in the sense it does add to your GDP, but ultimately we need to get the migration numbers down significantly so that we can bring the cost of housing down. So to me, all these things require reforms and tough decisions that may not be popular, but will make a long-term difference.
Rodson Hill, lots of dimensions, as we can hear, contributing to the cost of living that we're all suffering as a crisis for so many people. A lot of people, close to homelessness because of cost of living increases. Was there enough, do you think, in the budget at all addressing some of these areas that might bring some sort of structural reform that might actually ease cost of living long term?
No. That's simple, isn't it? Look, the budget doesn't address those issues at all. And as we've mentioned a little earlier, these cost of living relief measures in the budget don't actually attack the core problem, which is the cost of producing things. And we're talking here energy. There have been a lot of changes to labour market policy under the current government. They have all added to costs. Talk to anybody in business. These changes have added to costs. So, and everybody pays those additional costs. There's very little in the budget to do anything on the supply side of housing, and this is the issue. Subsidies and so on, they will only increase demand. That'll drive the price up and make it impossible for more people to enter the market. There are some moves to the creation of a pool of modular homes and so on and so forth, but they'll have a very tiny impact on supply. The federal and state governments and local governments need to get together and really work on the issue of releasing land and reducing all of the charges that are applied to land development, because that is what is making housing so expensive.
Okay, so when we talk solutions, and we haven't got a lot of time before news, let me come back to you for a moment here and for a quick response, Alex Cook. If we talk solutions around some of these areas for cost of living relief, when Rod says more land needs to be released, anything else come to mind for you?
Yeah, well, he's 100% right. And the one I'd add to that, as I say, I think is immigration. I think Australia has 1 million international students at the moment. So that brings in enormous pressure on the rental markets in the capital cities. So we just need to say, who are we running Australia for? To me, it's for the prosperity and flourishing of its citizens. But when I look at a lot of the policies, that's not the outcome. So I think the land development one's a good one, as Rod said. I think immigration's an issue. I think the subsidies should all be cut because all they do is drive prices higher. One scheme that they've come up with, which is legislated but not yet in force, because it hasn't started yet, is the Help to Buy scheme, where you co-own your home with the government. So the government owns 40% of your house and you'll own 60%, and you can buy the government out over the long term. So they've got all these sort of things that they're coming up with.
In fact, gentlemen, I think let's take a call or two, and there's certainly some more important things we'll want to come to, but let's see what our listeners are saying. Luke is in Rockhampton in Queensland. Hello, Luke. Welcome along. Need to be quick, but what are your thoughts?
Just one very quick question for anyone who wanted to answer it. What would happen, as some people have asked for, if we were to put a full freeze on immigration and international students for a set amount of time? What would be the ramifications, I suppose, of that happening, and would anyone actually have the guts to do it?
Okay, well, let me come to Rod St Hill on this. If there was a full freeze, now we talk about 500,000 over the past couple of years, thoughts here for Luke?
Yes, I don't think that would be a good idea, especially in terms of freezing students. All the universities in Australia would collapse, and most of the private providers would as well, because they now rely so heavily on international students for revenue.
Okay, so what we're talking about here is student immigration, but what about worker immigration too? And I'm not sure what the breakdown is on those, but what you're saying is our tertiary sector would collapse without this. So it's a necessary part of our economy.
There needs to be a planned reduction. We need to get back to roughly the average that we had during the Howard years, so maybe 150,000 a year.
Yeah.
Luke, how does that satisfy your question?
That's not bad. That sounds about right as what other people have been saying, but would anybody on either side of what we call the major parties actually stand up and do something like that? That's the other question.
Who's got the courage to do anything if it comes to moderating our immigration rates? Do you have a comment here, Alex Cook?
I don't think they do have the courage. I think they, as I say, when you're in government, you want to keep the economy whirling. Bringing people into the economy brings spending, pumps up the GDP. So I don't think, and Rod's right, if you took away too much, the education sector would collapse, and of course you'd drive us into a deep recession if you did it. So I think none of them want that on their watch. So they're very cautious to reduce it at all. I mean, they all say publicly they want to reduce it, but then when it comes to the reality, they don't follow through. I think the figure Rod suggested earlier would be about right, probably the 150 a year. I would hope maybe a bit lower, but certainly it's a net positive. It's just at the moment there's too much. The infrastructure can't cope. You see it with, waiting queues for hospitals and all sorts of things. So, but I don't think there's the courage to significantly reform it.
Okay, Luke in Rockhampton, thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Let's take another call. Alex is in Melbourne. Hey, Alex, welcome.
Oh, hello there. I heard Rod say to free regarding housing, to free up the land and reduce the cost of production. I just wondering what those costs were. If you can elaborate, please.
Rod?
I wish I had that in front of me, but we're talking about tens of thousands in the major metropolitan areas. The charges applied to developers would amount to probably $70,000 or $80,000 per house, but I'm just not exactly sure. But it's tens of thousands of dollars.
Okay, Alex, anything further?
No, that's all. Thank you.
All right, Rod.
On that subject. No, I probably couldn't say anything further.
Alex, thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Let's hear from Adam in Wauchope in New South Wales. Adam, welcome along.
Oh, hi there, gentlemen. Just wanted to give a little bit of inside information on both real estate front and also the immigration front, where there's some gaping holes. And immigration is probably the biggest problem we've had here over the last 30 years. I hate the word regulate, but one thing that does need to be regulated is immigrants when they do come in. They actually, I'm married to an immigrant of 8 years, so I can see how they work. They work exactly how they do in their own countries. When they come here, they want to run everything the same way they did in their native country, which is not the same way our country works. So that pushes the work rate down. The dollar that they earn is much less than what we earn, and they work longer hours, so the money we have to earn is a lot harder to earn.
No doubt there's got to be some regulations around that, but I'll come back to Rod St Hill here. Rod, you got a comment here for Adam?
I guess this is partly a commentary on cultural change, and one good reason for limiting immigration is to preserve the culture, and this is probably got nothing to do with the budget, but we do see that there are significant cultural tensions in Australia now that I think arise because we have had too much immigration without thinking really carefully about what that might do to the character of the Australian culture.
Let me come to Gavin Martin here. Have you got anything to add here? You're working with people. You're based and business for you is in Melbourne. It's a very multicultural city. What are your thoughts around the issues that Adam's talking about?
I understand Adam's just talking about working longer hours at a lower rate, and then that pushes everybody else's wages down. Is that correct? Is that what I'm understanding there?
And at a legal rate as well. It's sort of like an own economy. It's a sub-economy that's actually not part of our real Australian economy, if I can say that gently.
And potentially a cash economy as well.
Yeah. Which is not just only for immigrants. That's a problem for a lot of businesses and so forth. But it's and also illegals in here when they are students, then they end up being working illegally and all the rest of it, and pushing out people that are actually legitimate here to work in this country. So I know that's been brought up. Those visa things have been brought up many times over the past few years. But this is where this whole economy there's a whole economy going on under our real economy, which is actually affecting our real economy to great length.
Good point you're making here, Adam, because everyone will know that there is a cash economy that does operate beneath the surface, and governments are not even talking about that. Sometimes they do try to regulate that, and cash might be on the way out. That might be the heavy-handed way to do that. But Gavin Martin, what is your response here for Adam?
Yeah, I think I experience a bit of the opposite in that, and relate it to the NDIS. When we're competing for staff, we're often recruiting new grads, and they're often, or students coming through, almost finishing a degree, etc. They're actually seeing the opportunity with the NDIS, and I reckon the NDIS is this big hole that so much money is going into. Kids with no qualifications being paid, $50, $60, $70, $80 an hour with no qualifications, and that then makes other businesses have to pay a higher rate. So whilst Adam's dealing with the opposite, where wages are being pushed down because they're prepared, some people are prepared to work at a lower rate, we're experiencing the opposite in that I think wages are being pushed artificially high, and relating that to if I've got time, the building industry, and why there's a lack of supply of workers in the building industry is that so many of the workers, particularly in Victoria, are on government projects. All the trades are being sucked into government projects, and that means that there's a lot less available for building houses. So, a little bit of the opposite end of the spectrum to what Adam's experiencing there.
Adam, I hope that was some helpful comment. I'm going to have to let you go, but I really appreciate you calling in and raising that. Adam in Wauchope in New South Wales. When we're talking two levels of economy, and when we're talking about government and government projects, that's an interesting development that's been happening here. The size of the public service growing, I think, 42,000, somebody said, this coming year. When we're talking about the way that government grows, sometimes we talk about big government and small government. Rod St Hill, do you have a perspective here? Nothing in the budget last night indicated any sort of small government. You've got the opposition saying that they have a plan to make government smaller. Is there a way we might understand that, and is there a dimension there that might even have a faith dimension?
Well, look, I think there is a case for smaller government, because as government grows, regulation grows, and that impinges upon the freedom of individuals to act in a whole range of ways. So smaller government is desirable, but we do have to understand that smaller government probably means that we are not going to be able to continue to be as generous on the social welfare side of things. So this is why we need very courageous political leadership. And I've heard all kinds of rhetoric from alternative leaders, but we don't see the evidence that when they get into power that they use their position to actually make the big changes. And I think we should aim over a period of a decade or so for government to be around about 20% of GDP. Government expenditure in the current budget, the next financial year, will be 27% of GDP, and the tax ratio is 23.5% of GDP. So getting up to close to a quarter of GDP is taxes, and that is a tax on wealth creation, because about 20% of taxpayers pay 80% of the tax. They're the high income earners. And there's fewer than 50 companies that pay the bulk, like about 70%, of the company tax. So the best wealth creators in our country are being taxed to the hilt in order to fund all of these programs of government. And most government spending is just taking money from some people and giving it to other people. And you can't keep doing that forever.
Okay, taking money from some people, giving it to other people, and describing even the growth of the size of government, aligning that even with the way that our social welfare is continuing to grow at the same time. Alex Cook, do you have a perception in all of this?
I share similar views to Rod, but my comment would be I think we need a national discussion about what is the role of government and what's the role of government in our lives. What should it do? I mean, there's a few obvious ones. It needs to provide for defence, it needs to provide for rule of law. But when you look at Australia now, it's just grown and grown and grown and provides welfare across so many different sectors. I mean, the NDIS, for example, is just totally out of control, growing at something ridiculous 20% per annum. And I think, an enormous amount of people are on it. So I think, and this is the tough part. The tough part is you're going to have to take away from people a lot of these benefits in order to shrink the size of government, and that's going to take it needs a national discussion, because I think once you give people things, it becomes very hard to take it away. In fact, there was a famous saying 100 years ago that says democracy ultimately fails when people realise that they control the treasury. In other words, the more your voting controls the cookie jar and what they give you, and I think that's the problem now. Is it's just grown and grown and grown. It's out of control. It's not sustainable, and it's also destroying the society in the sense that you want a society of people that are, working hard, have initiative. It's worth setting up a business. It's worth doing all these things. But as government crowds it all out, people become less and less willing to do these things. And we've got an enormous percentage of the population now that are very government dependent. And so to take that away, I think, will be enormously difficult, require courageous leadership. But I think this is where the church, and to Rod's point, the church has a wonderful opportunity, because really, from a biblical point of view, I don't believe it's the government's role, and people will debate this, I don't believe it's the government's role to provide welfare in the way people think about it, providing all these benefits to people. To me, it's the church's role to help people, and to help them by giving them a hand, lifting them up out of their situation, providing them employment, education, all those kind of things. I mean, if you look at history, it's the church that started hospitals, it's the church that started schools, all these sort of things. So we have an enormous role to play that we can do rather than letting the government do it. And that'll be a lot more efficient, and it'll also change the culture of the people, where they reduce. We've got to get away from the dependency mindset, because it's gonna destroy our society as more and more people become dependent.
Okay, the thought of social welfare handouts. Rod St Hill, is there a Christian response to this? Because even as Alex says, somebody's got to have the courage to take away. That doesn't sound very Christian, does it? Because there might be some people who are absolutely in need. Maybe there's rotting of the system that needs to be fixed, but what's the Christian dimension here to how you resolve or look at or plan for a change when it comes to our huge social welfare handouts?
Well, look, I think a really important component of a Christian worldview is the idea of ambition. that we want to be better in the future than we are right now. And that's in many different ways in terms of our spiritual development, but also in terms of our economic situation. Most of the welfare components of the federal government budget are handouts. And we really need to have a mentality of hand up so that we encourage ambition. And I think one of the strengths of the Christian church is that we've always embraced the ambition to be better. And so I think as a pastor myself, it's not just about what happens on Sunday. It's about reaching out into the community and finding those people who are currently receiving handouts and then working with them and lots of other community organisations to bring them up to a higher level where they don't need the handout anymore. And to be sure, there are some people who will always need a handout because for no fault of their own, they cannot fully participate in the economic life of the nation. But as the further entrenched a handout mentality becomes, the less vigour there will be in the economy overall, and it will just slowly die. So growth will die off, and we'll end up falling way, way down in the league tables in terms of our well-offness based on a whole range of different measures.
All right, let's just reflect on some texts that have been coming through from listeners. Isaac says, the biggest issue of freeing up land for fixing housing is land developers farming the profit from it and prices remaining the same. Not sure. I'll just mention a few of these here, and if anyone wants to chime in with a response for any of these. Another note here. I don't think I've got a name on this one. We are actually in a position where we need to go back to a former Treasurer's statement of a recession we have to have. Is that what it would take to get us back towards straight tracks for our children and grandchildren? And I'll just hold a thought or two on that. Another comment here says, I hear people often say that there needs to be more land released. What do you mean? I don't think there were vast tracts of land stored up for housing, so then does it just mean turning more farming land and countryside into suburbs? Isn't urban sprawl another problem that successive governments are ignoring? Let me just come to Gavin Martin. Any of those comments catch your imagination?
Yeah, my experience on the housing front is that, there are developers that sit on land for a while. But experience with clients is that, and some have gone and bought blocks of land, but it's not the actual land price that's the problem, but it's now the build price that's the big issue. So it's all around the additional costs associated with that's the major problem. You can buy an existing property for cheaper than what you can build one these days, and you end up over-capitalising. So I've got a number of clients in that situation at the moment. That's the experience, particularly in regional areas where there is lots of supply of land. It's just the build cost that's preventing people from moving ahead in that space. That's where I think more work needs to be done. That's where it relates to supply of workers. I know there are initiatives to get more workers through trade courses with $10,000 incentives, and great. But at the same time, I think some of our infrastructure spend is going way over the top and spending too much of our government money on unnecessarily unsubstantiated projects.
Alex Cook, just a week or so ago, we were talking about your outlook on a global economy. When we talk about this idea harkening back to Paul Keating's words, the recession we had to have, I think that was back to late 80s, early 90s. Do we need another recession to get things back on track? Or are we heading that way anyway?
I think we're heading that way anyway, because I think the uncertainty being created out of the US, although I agree with a lot of the direction that Trump is taking, but certainly a recession to me is a normal part of the business cycle. My concern is actually the response that politicians have to it to quickly prop it back up rather than allowing the system to cleanse itself out. So to me, I think in a free market system, you actually have recession is just a normal part of the cycle. Yes, some people will lose their jobs and there's there's some unfortunate things, but it does allow for capital that was misallocated to be reallocated to stronger areas and better areas. So I think recession is a good thing in that sense, and we shouldn't try and stop them per se, maybe try and cushion them a little bit better when they happen. But I think the problem with both sides of Parliament in that regard is that the moment you do get a slowdown, you're going to get more borrowing. They're just going to try and prop it straight back up rather than allowing the system to adjust itself naturally. And that's I think the problematic we've got with the current ideology on both sides of Parliament.
Okay, let's come back to the welfare mentality, because I think this seems to be one of those key things, and we might hope that either the government or an opposition might have some answers here. The welfare mentality and the thought that we were talking about earlier on, Rod St Hill, productivity, welfare working against productivity. If you're going to fix some of the economic problems, that welfare just becomes so much the central focus, doesn't it?
Well, it can, and I'm sure everybody has anecdotal evidence that people refuse to work because it's going to impinge on their welfare payments. And some years ago, the language changed, and people started referring to their welfare payments as their pay. Well, it's not their pay because they haven't done anything to earn that pay. And so I think we've entrenched the idea that we have a right to handouts when actually we have an obligation to better ourselves. I think that's an obligation on us as members of our society. It suits governments, I think, to have a lot of people on social welfare because they have a lot more control of the people that way. But look, honestly, we can only get ahead ultimately if private businesses are producing goods and services for sale onto the markets, and if they're providing sustainable, well-remunerated work. And that's where the focus has to be ultimately. And I think we've got a role in that in the church to change those cultural values and ways of thinking.
Let's come back to this burgeoning national debt. We're talking about hitting $1 trillion national debt this year. I wonder if there is a biblical Christian principle, some sort of foundation by which we might be able to interpret how that ought to be dealt with, or what sort of positions our government or our opposition needs to take in a time like this. If I come to you first, Rod St Hill, national debt, nearly $1 trillion. The interest payments on that alone are astronomical. But so how do we look at that as Christian believers?
Look, I think the Christian principle is this: we should not burden our children to pay for our consumption today, and that's what it amounts to.
Okay. Alex Cook, have you got a dimension when it comes to the sort of stewardship required to deal with things like, a huge debt that faces a nation?
Well, I think the sad part of it is ultimately as your interest payments grow, it crowds out other spending. So ultimately it's going to lead to cutbacks in areas that Australians do currently enjoy that they will have taken away from them as the debt burden grows and grows and grows. To me, from a biblical point of view, there's a couple of scriptures that speak to this. One is that the Bible warns that it leads to slavery, and ultimately I think the risk is that taxes have to rise in order to pay it. So you're going to end up with this horrible high tax society. And as Rod's pointed out earlier, we're already a high tax society as it is, as a percentage of GDP. So it's only going to get worse if the interest continues to rise, and particularly eventually if the bond market reacts negatively to it and starts demanding higher payments, because I think the crises, particularly in Europe and America, are a warning sign that eventually investors start saying, well, we're not going to fund your debt anymore, and they demand higher interest rates, and then it all spirals out of control. So it can then become a very big problem. The Bible also says the wicked don't repay. And my concern, I think, with politicians is they keep borrowing, and there is no intent to repay. They push it into the future, and so there's an element, I think, of wickedness to that, where we're just racking up the country's credit card, but there is no actual intent to repay what's been borrowed. And so that to me is a moral issue and will lead to all sorts of, problems in society, particularly as taxes rises and, important expenditure gets cut. That's where it'll end up.
Gavin Martin, what are your perspectives here too? And, just to talk personally here, I know you're a father of 7. And I think it's still 7. Every time I talk to you, there's an extra one on the way. But, you're a father and you'll be concerned to have a inheritance to pass on to your own children, and then there'll be grandchildren, next generations, the moral implications that have come up in a couple of these responses here. How do you see things like that? And whether we just sort of sweep it to the side, this idea of $1 trillion national debt. No one seems to be that concerned about it. How do you think of that when you think of your own fatherhood, but also in a national dimension?
Yeah, it's a great concern. I think, as Alex and Rod have mentioned, that we need some politicians to take some courage and to start to repay this debt, or it will be a massive burden on the next generation. We're an ageing population, and it's only going to put more and more responsibility on fewer people to pay back this debt. So we are borrowing significantly from the next generation. We're talking about federal debt here, and if you live in Victoria, there's a massive amount of state debt to go on top of that as well. And we're seeing taxes increase significantly from land tax, etc. Yeah, so I'm worried. I haven't had any more kids recently. Well, the youngest is now 10, Neil. But I do worry about them and the burden that they're going to face because of our poor decision making and not being courageous enough to make those tough decisions to pay off that $1 trillion debt.
1-800-316-316. Let's take a call. Anne is in Labrador. Hi, Anne. Need to be quick, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's okay. Well, my thought is about the welfare system. I know that young people need to get off that because they're going to just live and then it's going to carry on through the families and everything like that. But I think the other thing is that sometimes you get into a job and they don't have experience. So I reckon they should have a set things that people go in to volunteer and get some experience so then they can get into a job. And the other thing that I think is very hard is when a person's nearly time for retirement and then they get their job, they redundant or something like that, and they can't. So I think we should help those. But these young people, they need to get into something like that or get into boot camp or army or something and take off that kind of welfare. But the ones that can't because they're too old and they're in their system before age, but they are too old to maybe enter into another job situation sometimes. So that's how I feel about
there's
the
some
welfare.
big dimensions in there too, so far as welfare goes, and even the state of our volunteerism and the state of those who might be retirees. How do you make those extra few dollars? I think I'll move on from there and take those as like a very good comment. But Anne, thank you so much for your call. Come back to this national debt for a moment. The moral implications, passing on debt to future generations. Proverbs 13:22 says, "A good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children," suggesting that it's important to consider the long-term impact of financial decisions. This is a courage issue again, is it not, Rod St Hill? Because no one's got enough courage to actually attack what is needed to be attacked.
Exactly. Look, without being too poetic about it, the most significant deficit that we have is a deficit of political courage, political leadership, and that's what we desperately need, because we won't deal with the other deficits until we get such leadership.
Squeezing in one more call. Steve is in Springhurst in Victoria. Hey, Steve, welcome along.
Good morning. Hi.
Steve, what are your thoughts?
I haven't been over the whole conversation, but I think the biggest problem is it's not the politicians' money. Like, they're spending our money to keep themselves in power, especially as we move away from our Christian moorings of our society, that they're just propping up their own political system by spending our money to keep themselves, give us free money and get us to vote for them. So just don't know how we, combat that as a society, but yeah, it's a massive problem. Like, I'm in Victoria and they've just spent so much money on all this stuff to buy themselves votes. So,
Alex Cook, have you got a response here for Steve?
I have a solution. Unfortunately, I won't get elected on it. And I believe that we need to remove career politicians. I don't believe it should be a career. I believe you want people, if you think about the whole concept of public servant, we want people that are attracted to public service to contribute to the country, and that should be for a short period, whether it's 1 or 2 terms. I think it should be absolute maximum of 2 terms, and I think that would go a long way to solving some of these issues, particularly the courage issue that Rod's alluded to. And I think the problem you have is you have people in there who are doing it and want to keep their job. So they're in this short cycle, and their goal is just to keep getting elected at the next time round, as opposed to someone who comes in who's not there for a career, but just comes in for a short period to make a difference. So I think you need that reform. As I say, I don't think the problem you've got is the current crop of politicians are not going to vote themselves out of a job. So maybe things have to get really bad for that sort of policy to take place. But career politicians is what I would get rid of immediately.
Okay. Steve in Springhurst in Victoria, thank you so much for your call. Time is running short. Let's just get an impression, a quick overall. The opposition's going to be delivering a reply on Thursday night. I'm just wondering whether you think our conversation today might be any different if we'd heard both sides first. First of all, Rod St Hill, what would you think? Are we likely to hear anything that's earth-shattering on Thursday night?
Look, I don't know, but I suspect if we knew what was going to happen, we'd have to talk for another hour or so. Look, I have heard the Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, in lengthy interviews. I think he's got a good conservative heart, but the big issue is, does he have the courage, and does he even have the constituency within his own party to say no to the spending? That's going to be the big test on Thursday night, and I don't know whether he can. And look, I believe that Labor are going to introduce the legislation on the tax cuts immediately. They might even try to do it before Thursday night. So it's just a wicked problem. But I really do hope that he'll have the courage to say enough is enough, because we are not doing the right thing for future generations if we continue as we are.
Gavin Martin, is there something in the Thursday night, tomorrow night budget reply from the Leader of the Opposition that you think ought to be there? What's your impression? Would it make any difference if we knew both sides, with our conversation now bringing a biblical Christian worldview focus on the economy?
Yeah, probably would make a big difference. I see so many of the initiatives that are announced in this very thin, light-on budget as being lazy and untargeted. What I'm hoping for in Thursday night is a focus on productivity and really specific targeted initiatives rather than light and easy across-the-board election-focused policies that we've seen in this budget. So I'm hopeful, but we'll see.
Alex Cook, leave the final impression to you. What would your thoughts be about what might be delivered tomorrow night? Will it make any difference, do you think?
To be honest, I think it'll be pretty minimal. I think, I hope Gavin's right. You know, you have the targeted initiatives, but I think Rod will be proven correct, and that is there's a courage issue. And also, I think the key point that Rod made also is the constituency. Is there enough people within the party to go along with it? You know, you got lots of conflicts of interest within the party itself. And so whether or not the reforms are doable is yet to be seen. And of course, they've got to win. And of course, to win, I think there's the short-term, human nature is such that people want that short-term relief. I think that's the human nature side of it that they're fighting against. And that makes it difficult to get elected. So It's a challenge.
And just quickly, we might be talking about the major parties. They're the ones who will form government, no matter what the outcomes of the next federal election look like. There are minor parties around the periphery, and they've got a space there, and some of them are fighting for a voice. Just a quick comment from you, Rodson Hill, because we're going to tie things up here. I mean, are there other voices on the landscape that are not being heard at the moment? We might say the Christian voice in these things is not really being heard, but what are your thoughts about, others around the periphery?
Oh, look, well, in the interest of full disclosure, I am a member of a Christian political party. What I would say is this: a vote for a minor party is not a wasted vote because of the way in which our electoral system works. And I think we should very carefully consider our vote. A vote for a minor party, such as a Christian political party, is not a wasted vote. What will really determine the outcome of the election ultimately will be what you do with your preferences after your first preference. Historically, Conservative voters have not been very disciplined with their second preference vote. And I had a quick look at the electoral outcome for the last federal election. I'm pretty certain that if the Conservatives had been more disciplined with their vote, we wouldn't have had a Labor Party over the last 3 years.
All right. It makes sense that the federal election that is coming up is a very important one. And as you say, Rodson Hill, finding a minor party, finding someone who's got a biblical idea of that foundation of stewardship and perhaps of financial literacy according to some godly principle, that's going to be a very useful and necessary thing. Just to top off our conversation, one listener, Lisa, has sent a text in, says, loving the conversation. Would these men please stand for Parliament? We need men of strong faith and Christian worldview alongside their practical professional skills to step into this part of our country. We are, as the church, also need to be truly committed to backing those Christians in government with our practical support and especially through prayer. Thank you so much, Lisa, for your insight there too. And there's a few smiles on faces that I can see for those who are on video, and Rodson Hill, who's in the studio.
I'm voting for Rod.
I don't know. He might be thinking he's left his run too late. I don't know.
No, not at all. Never too long.
Now, as always, I like to just quickly say where you can be connected to our special guests that I have on 2020. Our three guests, Dr. Rodson Hill, ordained minister, economist, company director. He's currently pastoring Ignite Life Church, Gold Coast. He's a professor at the Leaders Institute in Brisbane, teaches management, international economic development. IgniteLifeChurch.com to connect with Dr. Rodson Hill. You can connect with Alex Cook. He's the founder of Wealth with Purpose, wealthwithpurpose.com, and Gavin Martin, who's the founder of Cornerstone Wealth. He's based in Melbourne, cornerstonewealth.com.au, and I'm sure all of these gentlemen won't mind if you did make contact and if you had a question or we're talking about the sorts of things they stand for and the sorts of things that they're involved in. To each of our guests, Rod, Alex and Gavin, I want to thank you so much for taking some time to share your thoughts, your expertise and your insights with our listeners today. Thanks, Rod.
You're very, very welcome.
Thank you so much to you, Alex.
Thanks, Neil.
And thank you to Gavin Martin.
Thank you, Neil. Great to be with you.